welcome everybody back to what is by now kind of officially the Jerusalem Martin J Club. And by now, I mean, all of you have been here before. I'm Dror Wahrman. I'm the chair of the history department here at the Hebrew University. I did not know George Moser personally, like many other people here, but I am greatly appreciative of the bequest, of his bequest, and what his bequest has done for us, for my department, for the relationship between my department and the University of Wisconsin, and for many students, many former students who are now faculty, who are professors in Israel and elsewhere, and postdocs, PhDs, master students. The list is huge. I actually just learned it's much bigger than I thought it was. So we're greatly appreciative of this, and I just wanted to start by making that comment. I'm also in a curious position here, introducing Martin J. for his third lecture, because I'm mostly a student of the 18th century, the Age of Reason. You know, Tom Paine, was there for a reason. And much of the writing about the end of reason is supposedly a dismantling of that project, right? In the 80s, I remember when I was still a student. See, that's kind of how it starts. In the 80s, I went to a conference which was all about that and had T-shirts which had a light bulb, and underneath the light bulb it said, "The Enlightenment, how do we turn it off?" But that's, even if that is a caricature, right? In a way, these are two opposite bookends of modernity. So when Marty opened the first lecture with 1941 as a very loaded moment, I was reminded of Susan Nyman's book on the problem of evil that starts with these two bookends, with Auschwitz on the one hand and the Lisbon earthquake on the other. And in truth, it's actually a particular interest to me, to see those ideas, which of those ideas that Marty unfolds for us in the engagement with the eclipse of reason in the second half of the 20th century that have precedence in the supposedly naive age of reason in the 18th century, not only in the counter-enlightenment, but often in the Enlightenment itself. And counter-enlightenment is a problematic term anyway. And actually, if you look for the term, the eclipse of reason, and you have now digital forms of searching which make this very easy, you'll find it very quickly used both by Paine himself, Tom Paine, and by his detractors about himself, right? So he's using about earlier periods. So many of those themes, for me, seem more familiar than I expected, I think. Now, introducing Martin J. at this point is a bit tricky, since you've already all been here and you've already heard the introductions before. So all I would say is, that Marty is one of the most prominent intellectual historians in North America, and actually everywhere, I think, anywhere rather. It's hard to imagine the reception of the Frankfurt School in North America without the dialectical imagination, without his book, without his work, and without everything that came after that. He's got an extremely long CV, which I will not repeat. It is amazing. A long list of books, endless list of articles, obviously written by somebody else because he couldn't do that. He was writing the books. A truly global list of visits and lectures all over the world, honorary lectures, prizes, and so on and so forth. Now, Steve gave you a taste of this on the first lecture when he listed the 14 or so languages into which the dialectical imagination was translated. But you missed one thing which I thought was particularly fantastic in this list, which is, in addition to all the translations of Jay's book, it also exists in pirated editions in Turkey and in Korea. Now, this seems to be an amazing achievement. I've never seen this in any academic file I've ever read. And so this is how you know you really made it. You're not just being reprinted, you're being pirated. Yeah, anyway, that's this is like, kind of like Tintin, Hergé gets pirated, and Martin J. Jay's CV also includes a very long list of interviews, and I read a couple, kind of in preparation. And one in particular, one little bit kind of caught my attention, which is when he talks about intellectual history as a pursuit. Intellectual history which today often finds itself competing with other forms of inquiry. And so I found this interview, a statement of his about what intellectual history does, which I found attractive both for its soundness, but also and especially for its quiet and confident modesty. So let me just read you this bit from Martin J's interview. He says this: "I think intellectual history, to the extent that it has current impact, plays the role of clarification. It shows us how and when certain ideas, ideologies, and belief systems emerge. A good Begriffsgeschichte will provide us with tools to think a little more clearly about where we are today. My own work, his own work that is, my own work has been very short on solutions. I don't have anything terribly useful to say about where we should go, except in the vaguest of terms. But it has, I think, contributed to clarifying the terms of the debate and giving us some help in that respect. I love the modesty of that, just a little bit of help here and there, but of course you know that what you're about to experience, right? If there is good Begriffsgeschichte, this is what we're about to hear. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Martin J. for the third and final lecture, From the Age of Reason to the Age of Reasons.
Thank you very much, Dror, for that over-the-top and extremely flattering introduction. I hadn't even remembered that interview. It's fascinating. You sort of say things and you never look at them.
The Dutch place, yeah.
Oh, right,
Dutch,
right. Crisis.
I
was pirated. All right, just very quickly to summarize where we are in this little tripartite journey through the history of reason in the Frankfurt School's recent development. The first lecture, I tried to spell out what I saw as a crisis in classical critical theory's attempt to defend a viable concept of reason in the light of its critique of instrumental reason, the withering of reason as something that had simply, in a way, survived solely in terms of instrumental reason. The second lecture, and after the first I talked a bit about Adorno's solution, aesthetic rationality, which I found not fully satisfactory. The second lecture, Habermas's Gamble, was an attempt to spell out Habermas's reformulation of rationality on very different grounds. And I argued that there were 8 different dimensions of his alternative solution. And let me see if I can remember all of them from memory. The first was the desubstantialization of reason, moving away from the idea that there is an objective reason in the world, either potentially or actually. Second, the detranscendentalization of reason, in which reason no longer is somehow inherent in the either transcendental or individual mind, the kind of mentalist version of reason. Third, it's desublimation, moving from something hovering above the world into the, we might say, practices and institutions of the historical world. Then the linguistification, the idea that reason has to be grounded in communicative rationality, in the pragmatic level of language. Then the pluralization of reason, the idea that there are, in fact, many different rationalities, not merely one, although there is perhaps a unity amidst its multiple voices. We have to keep the differences still alive rather than search for a single meta-notion of reason. Then the proceduralization of reason, the idea that reason must be understood in terms of discursive procedures of validity testing, argumentation, a way of coming up with good reasons, and I'll talk more about that today. And then the final two were the temporalization, the idea that reason is not something in the past, but something that we use to get towards a potential future that we'll never achieve as an absolute, let's say, utopian state of being, a kind of form of life, but it is a telos which pulls us forward. And finally, and this is in a way the most complicated, the as-if narrativization of reason through the evolutionary models he uses. So those were the 8, let's say, démarches, the 8 initiatives in the Habermasian tradition. And as I said at the very end, this was, certainly ripe for critique. What I'd like to do today, tell you a little bit about some of the criticisms, although I can't by any means canvass the whole territory, and then focus on one issue, the issue of what constitutes a good, or we might even call it a rational reason when you give reasons. Now, as might be expected in a system as bold and ambitious as Habermas's, an enormous critical response has ensued, a response which touches on each and every aspect of his argument. Some commentators have claimed that any defense of reason is a dangerous search for a transcendental universalism, wisely abandoned by honest historicists, undaunted by cultural relativism, people like Richard Rorty. Others have argued that he should, in fact, embrace a more frankly philosophical and transcendental justification of his critical standpoint, and thus find a way to ground reason more firmly than he has been able to do in hardwired characteristics of the human condition, perhaps Oppel. Some critics have denounced Habermas's proceduralist notion of reason as too thin, too bloodless, turning to alternatives, and they've derived them from Heidegger, from Castoriadis, and others. Still other critics have claimed that his overly cognitivist version of action means he underplays affective and non-rational motivations for human behavior, which can't be reduced to the argumentative procedures of discursive validity testing. Even older approaches, such as Thomist Aristotelianism, have been defended by Alasdair MacIntyre and his followers. They want to ground a holistic, undifferentiated notion of reason in tradition. Without a stronger substantively rational concept of the good life, these critics worry that the motivation for critique is lacking. Others, drawing on Sartre or defending idealist philosophies of the subject, have challenged Habermas's granting of logical and psychological priority to intersubjectivity. I think here of someone like Manfred Frank, arguing that not every version of the subject must imply the domination of the object or the privileging of cognition over recognition. And then some champions of post-structuralism have faulted Habermas for imposing a German narrative where modernity and rationality are understandably an urgent and ongoing project in the wake of Nazism, on a French narrative where rationality was already tried in politics with disastrous consequences during the French Revolution, Vincent de Combe. Some have argued that he's too holistic, he's too Hegelian, others that he is not holistic and Hegelian enough. In other words, from every end of the spectrum, outside of the critical theory tradition, there have come antagonistic criticism trying to undermine the argument. But also within what we might call the third generation of critical theory, within Habermas's own tribe, we might say, there have been also some very, I would say, culturally, constructively critical comments. Some adherents, for example, of the first generation of critical theory have endorsed Adorno's belief in art as the placeholder of a lost objective notion of reason. For example, Jay and Bernstein. Others have preferred Marcuse's reason and revolution to Habermas's reason and evolution, lamenting the latter's acceptance of at least some instrumental rationalism and domination of the natural world. They still hold out hopes for a revolution that would undo even the instrumental rationality of technology, for example, Andy Feinberg. The rational reconstruction of a normative evolutionary development for all the differentiated spheres of modern rationality has, to add yet another criticism, not convinced those who fear that it smuggles in covert Eurocentric values in the guise of universalism. Tom McCarthy. Western notions of deliberative democracy and legal formalism, so other critics have worried, can too easily turn into the telos of a species-wide project. The passionate rationality of what he calls constitutional patriotism may be preferable to the ardor of national tribalism, but only in a polity like the post-national Germany that Habermas has sought so doggedly to liberate from its traumatic past, but, well, maybe not elsewhere. The parallel between individual ontogenetic development and species learning is for still others perhaps a bit too quickly drawn, as is the attribution of communicative rationality to the pre-reflective life world before the crystallization of the reflexive specialist discourses that emerge from it. While some critics claim Habermas reifies the differentiated value spheres of modernity, others say his attempt to overcome that very differentiation, which he metaphorically characterizes as a free play between them, is in fact something that's really under-theorized. We're not sure how the free play, the negotiation, takes place. Still others complain that the normative ground of the ideal balance among the differentiated spheres has not been sufficiently developed. So, all right, you overcome the hypertrophy of instrumental rationality, systems rationality, but how should they all be somehow, in a positive way, a good way, brought together? Who, other critics have asked, who are the concrete social actors who will embody the struggle to restore the balance between the types of rationalization based on an action theoretical notion of power? I mean, one of the things that Habermas did by jettisoning praxis philosophy and Marxism was get rid of the idea of a meta-subject, an agent in history, a vanguard, proletariat, whatever, without embracing any new concrete alternative. So it becomes somehow very diffuse. Who will, in fact, be the bearers of critique? Even the ideal of rational agreement or consensus as a sufficient basis for democratic liberation has been questioned by some of his most loyal defenders. Once again, Tom McCarthy, who argues that compromise is needed. Well, in any event, it would be easy to multiply other qualms made by friendly as well as hostile critics. So Habermas has been, over his entire career, engaged in, I think, in some ways, a polemical context unparalleled by virtually any other philosopher. Now, if Habermas's elaborate system, with all of its appropriations of different insights from so many philosophical, sociological, linguistic, psychological, anthropological, and so on sources, if it were only as strong as its weakest link, it would be, I think, seriously compromised. For many of these objections, ones raised to the various component parts, have been telling, and many have required him, in fact, tacitly or explicitly, to abandon some of his initial arguments and formulations and modify others. Habermas himself, however, has been tireless in his willingness to learn from the criticisms and attempt to meet them responsibly. Thus, I would say this is an important point, embodying precisely the values of the communicative rationality he champions. It is hard to think of another major thinker who's engaged in so many forums over the years devoted to the critical examination of his or her own work. In a way, he embodies performative consistency in this precise sense. And as a result, the identification of reason with an ongoing process of reasoning among equals with better arguments, outweighing the authority of those who make them, Habermas is somehow the legislator, has been performatively confirmed in his own practice, which itself has been a kind of learning process, and one that's shared by all of those who have accompanied him on this voyage. And beyond purely academic debates among experts, Habermas is also consistently and often rather courageously engaged in the heated political debates of his day. It may well therefore be justified to conclude with Sheila Ben Habib, quote, that the fact that the theory of communicative action has not provided the answer to all these questions is not an argument against it, but for it. The issue is, does it succeed in generating future research hypotheses which are fruitful and subject to refutation? So this, in a way, is a mark of reason in the Habermasian sense. Not that it answers, ends, puts a stop, comes to a complete halt, but rather generates new questions. Despite the still ongoing debate about his work, indeed as evidenced by that very debate, it's fair to say that a paradigm shift, I think, has occurred in our appreciation of the stakes involved in defending reason as a ground of critique against those who have reduced it to a mere tool in the service of some deeper purpose, such as power or self-preservation. If we could put it in a nutshell, it might be said that we've left behind both the Enlightenment age of reason and the counter-Enlightenment, broadly speaking, and maybe it's a term we could do without, but let's call it the age of reason's other, and enter the age of reasons, in which that space, the space of reasons of which Wilfrid Sellars spoke, is more than just a metaphor, but has been given institutional embodiment in the political, cultural, legal, scientific, and other public spheres of modern life. Imperfectly, always challenged, but nonetheless palpably there. In the phrase of the American literary critic Amanda Anderson, it is a space in which argument as ethos prevails, a kind of post-conventional Sittlichkeit, to use Hegel's term, post-conventional ethical form of life. That ethos is distant, it bears repeating, from the identitarian logic of the traditional version of rationalism. As Albrecht Wellmer has put it, quote, argumentation, which by definition implies a plurality of subjects, even where it takes the form of internalized reflections, as in psychoanalysis when you're in a sense trying to reason about your own symptoms, which by definition implies a plurality of subjects, not only does not possess the linearity of deductive relationships between statements, it also lacks the stability of rigid meanings. So it has this sense of inherent openness as a virtue. In temporal terms, it's also open-ended, because the process of reasoning, of learning, based on a fallibilist notion of truth, is understood never to reach a final point of arrival. Modernity, as we've seen for Habermas, is not a completable project, and that's ultimately a good thing. The temporal center of gravity of giving reasons is a future potential consensus rather than a recovery of a past foundation or ground, even a future that may never be fully realized. So the idea of somehow anamnestic totalization, coming back to a lost reason, hermeneutics, we might say, recovery, is not in fact what this posits. Now, if one were to focus on one particularly crucial dimension of Habermas's efforts to rescue reason after its eclipse, it would perhaps be best, in the time we have remaining, to look at the notion of giving reasons itself, something that we take for granted, but we can unpack. What does it mean to give a reason? Something which is so crucial in the process of validity testing inherent in communicative rationality. To make sense of it, we have to go back a bit. We have to look at an earlier moment in the history of thinking about reason. In the version of the principle of sufficient reason, favored by Enlightenment rationalists like Spinoza and Leibniz, there had been no explicit distinction made between cause, whether it be efficient or final or material or formal, cause on the one hand and reason. Both were included in the key phrase nihil est sine ratione, nothing is without reason, a metaphysical version of a theological premise, which is that everything made by God, the most contingent and seemingly irrational phenomena of the world, is made for a reason, is made for a cause. When Heidegger came to write his work, Der Satz vom Grund, in 1957, translated into English as The Principle of Reason, he noted, quote, that Leibniz obviously posits the principle of reason and the principle of causality as being equivalent, end quote. Both were implied by the German word Grund, which also can, of course, be used for foundation or base. Whereas, however, discerning a cause might suggest the cognitive relationship between individual or transcendental subject and external object, that I as a subject see something in the world, I put my hand in a fire, I get burned, I see the fire causing the pain, in which reason involved discovering and explaining causes that already existed in nature or the social world. When cause meant that, it had to be distinguished from reason. For reason, giving a reason, offering a reason, listening to others' reasons, implied instead an intersubjective interaction between those who argued about what those causes might be. As Habermas himself was to put it, quote, the speaker cannot intend her aim as something to be effected causally, because the yes and no of the hearer is a rationally motivated position. Participants in communication enjoy the freedom of being able to say no. So in other words, a cause is out there in a determinist universe, a natural universe, in which I stick my hand in the fire, it causes the pain. I can't argue with the fire. I give a reason, you could either choose to accept it or not. Give me a counter reason. So reasoning has a very different function. It's once again that I-you relationship we talked about last time as part of communicative interaction. The distinction between cause and reason also roughly corresponded to another crucial dichotomy, which had shadowed rationalism from the very beginning, the opposition between necessity and freedom. As Kant had famously argued, humans could be understood as divided beings, at once beholden to the causal laws of nature, our creaturely being animals within the world that determine our existence, and yet free to obey or disobey the moral obligations that practical reason told us that we ought to follow. Insofar as Grund indicated cause, it suggested determinism. Insofar as it meant giving a reason and the ability to weigh the reasons given by others, it connoted freedom, the freedom of the rational will. Now, it was apparently not until Arthur Schopenhauer and his fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, which was first published in 1813, that this distinction was explicitly drawn. He has fourfold roots, but one is cause and the other is reason in the sense we've talked about it. Heidegger, to be sure, had already discerned a certain slippage in the direction of subjects giving reasons in the extended version of the Latin phrase, which was principium redend, and my Latin, I'm sure the pronunciation is off, principium redende or redende rationis sufficiensis, the principle of rendering sufficient reasons, rendering sufficient reasons. This means, Heidegger wrote, that reason as such demands to be given back as reasons, namely back, re, in the direction of the representing, cognizing subject by this subject and for this subject, end quote. This is from Heidegger's Principle of Reason. Although Heidegger was by no means a champion of causal determinism, no question he was against that, he found this slippage from reason to giving reasons, rendering reasons, he found it disastrous. Why? Because it opened the way for a humanist alienation from the world, a loss of our immersion in being. He writes, The unique unleashing of the demand to render reasons threatens everything of humans' being in the world and robs them of the roots of their subsistence, the roots from out of which every great human age, every world-opening spirit, every molding of the human form has thus far grown. So in other words, what Heidegger would call world disclosure, where the world shows itself, the world manifests itself, the world reveals itself in the opening that allows being to show itself, Sein to Dasein, is very different from the demand to render reasons to a subject. Now, if one had to characterize Habermas's distance from Heidegger, one could do, I think, a lot worse than point precisely to his opposition to this very judgment. It was the development of that weak, non-dominating humanism mentioned on Tuesday that was enabled by the need to render reasons, to make them public, to take seriously the reasons rendered by others, to argue about their merits, rather than merely wait for God's inherent reasons come causes to reveal themselves. And Heidegger's world disclosure, we might say, and his famous last phrase about only a God being able to save us now, suggests that kind of passivity, an openness, a waiting for the revelation. To put it another way, communicative rationality is foundationless in the sense of no longer needing a firm ground prior to the process of reasoning itself. No transcendent point d'appui outside the infinite open-ended argument about its own sufficiency. What we might call the principle of sufficient reasons supplants the Leibnizian formula nihil est sine ratione, nothing is without a reason or cause. And as a result, it avoids the dark conclusion drawn by those, well, ever since Schelling really, about whom Habermas wrote his dissertation, who took the undermining of a metaphysical notion of reason to mean that without a firm Grund, a firm ground or basis, firm foundation, like the principle of sufficient reason, all that remained was the Abgrund, or the Ungrund, the abyss. So that alternative, either a firm ground or nihilism, or the abyss, or the Ungrund, is precisely what Habermas is trying to avoid. That we don't need to have that firm ground. We ought not, however, to fear falling into the abyss. But a challenge remained nonetheless, and this is, where I'm sort of entering areas that I feel perhaps, still very uncertain. Very interested in your own input in helping me deal with this. How to establish which reasons can be deemed sufficient. And I talked about the principle of sufficient reasons. Well, which ones are sufficient? Which ones have the honor, worthy of the honor, of being called rational, allowing us to say the outcome of the argumentation, the argumentative process, is not arbitrary, but is based, in fact, on some communicative rationality in the good sense of that term. It may be rational to seek a consensus based on the better argument in a discourse among equals, one that approaches the ideal speech situation, but is there a way to decide if that consensus has produced a rational result? So yes, procedural rationalism. We talk, we argue, no one has the better word. But how do we know the outcome is rational? What are the criteria, if any, used to distinguish a consensus based on dubious rhetoric, based on appeals to emotion, based on demagogic charisma, and so on, from one that justifiably might be rooted in unprejudiced validity testing based on the persuasive, not coercive, not manipulative, but persuasive force of the better argument? What are the criteria of a rational reason as opposed to an irrational reason? Though implicit in the idea of such a reason is the telos that would be voluntarily accepted by all who have the argumentative skills, the capacity for discernment, and access to relevant information, as well perhaps as the empathetic ability to see beyond their own narrow vantage point. Can these criteria ever be realized practically in real-life discussions, or are they doomed to be eternally regulative ideals, something towards which we are struggling but never fully actualized? Will the condition, moreover, be the same in cognitive, moral, and aesthetic discourses, where persuasion may depend on different levels, different kinds of evidence and logic? And this will take a lot of time to unpack, but cognitive validity testing, is it the same as moral validity testing? Well, maybe not. Aesthetic validity testing? Well, certainly not. In any event, defenders of the norms of traditional cultures, in Weber's sense of the term, can and do, after all, give reasons for their legitimacy. These norms, they say, have always existed. They are given by divine authority. They're grounded in nature. They come from scripture and so forth. Interestingly, Kant, who is often seen as privileging ahistorical formal rationality, Kant understood that in at least the child's initial acquisition of reason, there is in fact a dependence on traditional authority. In his work on pedagogy, and this is something that Axel Honneth has noted. He argued, quote, that the child's reason is formed through the internalization of the social reserve of knowledge that is amassed in the society in which the child grows to maturity, with the help of his or her parents or other primary caregivers. So the idea of the immature child who needs to be tutored, Kant holds on to this and suggests that perhaps others are also maybe in need of some help. Gadamer would have contended that such traditional reasons warrant respect even for adults, but Habermas argues against granting it to them without a test of their validity. But can there ever be a meta-argumentative standard by which one knows which reasons do meet the test? Can we say that there is a pathology of reasons comparable to the pathology of reason that reduces it to solely its instrumental variant? Or is it to claim that there's, or can we really say that there is only really one way, there is only one, I'm getting my sentence here, or is it to claim that there is one really only to stigmatize and advance what people believe justifies their consent? So that if we say there is a pathology of reason, does it simply stigmatize what other people do? What, in other words, justifies a reason being called rational? Put it somewhat differently, can we find a single mode of judgment to characterize a reason as more or less rational? Does it entail, for example, following rules in the sense of Kant's notion of determinate judgment, algorithms in which specific cases are subsumed under general principles? Or is it closer to what he called a reflective judgment, in which there are no rules, but rather analogies and paradigmatic cases acting as our less rigorous guides? Is deciding what is a rational reason a matter of what Aristotle would have called phronesis or practical wisdom? And if so, is it clear that all participants in a symmetrically organized speech situation possess that phronesis to the same degree? Or are there, and we saw it in Kant, enlightened tutors and immature minors? When Habermas argues, quote, that the rational acceptability of validity claims is ultimately based only on reasons that withstand objections under certain demanding conditions of communication, which allow, quote, if possible, all relevant information and explanations to be brought up and weighed, his critics wondered, and I think with some justification, by whose judgment that final point was reached. In other words, when do we know when all claims have been tested? When do we know that all objections, all possible objections, have been weighed? Now, Habermas dealt with this himself, and still, I think, struggles with it. He staunchly resisted any implication of elitism. In other words, he doesn't take the Kantian position. And he, in fact, takes the famous phrase of Kant, the kingdom of ends, and changes it to a republic of rational beings. Quite interesting, that metaphoric change. Not a kingdom with somebody on top like a tutor, but a republic in which we're all, as it were, citizens. In this egalitarian republic, quote, whether reasons are good reasons can be ascertained, he writes, only in the performative attitude of a participant in argumentation, and not through the neutral observation of what this or that participant in the discourse holds to be good reasons. So it's a level playing field. No one can be, as it were, the referee. At different moments in history, there'll be different criteria for what constitutes a good reason. This is that idea of reason that is desublimated in the actual institutions of the world, a good reason which themselves can be argued about, and only justified, if at all, through discourse. Denying any discursive God's eye view meant that, quote, the different forms of argumentation form a system precisely to the extent that they refer internally to one another. He underlines that. Refer internally to one another owing to their need for supplementation. The manner in which the transition is effected is regulated by the logic of argumentation. Whether and when we are supposed to accomplish it depends on the faculty of judgment inherent in communicative action itself. And then he adds, there are no meta-discourses for this. No meta-discourses. There are, in fact, no meta-discourses whatsoever. Every discourse is, so to speak, equally close to God, end quote. There is, in other words, no hierarchy of reasons, no final court of judgment. Quote, which reason counts as a good or indeed as the better reason, for what object, in what context, has to be assessed in terms of standards which under certain conditions become problematical and in turn require justification. So it's as if the ground rules, the standards, the context themselves change, themselves sometimes need to be justified and their validity tested. The only certain quality of a good or rational reason is its ability to persuade those involved in the subjective process of judging, but only, as Habermas's, I think, critical disciple Maeve Cook has noted, quote, in the context of their intuitions, expectations, commitments, convictions, and experiences as a whole. In other words, she says, to see something as a good reason, human subjects must be capable of integrating it into the affectively imbued constellation of reasons that are formative of their identities. So once again, never hovering above, but within, as it were, the fray. The result is that reasons become good when they are validated by others. Or as Maeve Cook pithily formulates it, reasons are not owned by the self, but owed to others. Not owned by the self, but owed to others. Moreover, they are not, excuse me, not protected from the critical gaze of others, but opened up to their critical judgments, end quote. Albrecht Velmer seconds this point, admitting that no extra-argumentative criterion for a rational reason can be found. He writes, the concept of a good reason is attached in an irreducible way to the perspective of the one persuaded by good reasons. One cannot describe from a meta perspective which qualities reasons must have in order to be really good reasons. To call reasons good is not the ascription of an objective quality. Rather, it is the adoption of an attitude with normative consequences. These reasons compel me to accept that P is true. And naturally, these are often the reasons that another being brings up. In this sense, linguistic communication is, among other things, also a medium for progress in knowledge. And I want to get back to that idea of progress in knowledge. Discarding the fantasy of a meta-discourse, a meta-perspective, a God's eye view, and acknowledging at least some contextual situatedness would help guard against an elitist, logocentric notion of reason when open to the charge of implicit authoritarianism. All right, so this is where the argument takes us so far. But Habermas critics wondered, is the idea of being compelled by reasons, is this really sufficient? Insofar as empirical compulsion is not always a sign of sober persuasion. I could be compelled by many other, maybe reasons I don't know, in my unconscious I'm not fully aware of. I can, after all, be compelled by my emotions just as easily by logic or evidence. As Habermas himself makes clear, quote, pragmatically irresistible reasons are not compelling reasons in the sense of logical validity. What allows us to decide which consensus is based on rational persuasion and which an irrational seduction or coercion, especially if we're denied a disinterested position outside of the context of discussion, this is very hard to, in fact, know in a very simple way. When do we know, in other words, when, quote, no arguments have been suppressed and that none of the participants has been prevented from putting forward relevant counter-arguments? And when do we know when that sort of point has been reached? Is it, moreover, something that happens in the process of judging or only as a long-term effect, which cannot be determined until time has passed through a kind of rational reconstruction of the narrative in which the decision can be situated? In other words, you have to wait and go back and see which ones, in fact, pass the test. But if you have to act, and Habermas is always talking about speech acts, you have to decide now, well, maybe it's not, you don't have the luxury of waiting. For one commentator, the German theorist Rainer Forst, who was one of Habermas's third-generation disciples, the criteria of reciprocity and generality are the answer, allowing us to reach outcomes that will be legitimately binding on all. Principles of reason, Forst writes, are principles acceptable to a plurality of actors on the basis of what he calls reasonable reasons, i.e. reasons that can be reciprocally and generally shaped, or to use Thomas Scanlon's phrase, that cannot reciprocally and generally be rejected. The latter reformulation allows us still to debate different versions of reasonable reasons without seeking a single answer. So that you can't reciprocally and generally reject them means that you may have different answers that can't be rejected. Because generality is tempered by reciprocity, such reasons have to acknowledge the particular qualities of individuals in the debate rather than assume that there is an overarching general principle, an abstract universal rule that can flatten them out. Or to put it in terms familiar from the sociology of George Herbert Mead, the concrete as well as general other must be taken into account. Here, however, and I'm not sure I really buy this, we're still operating only at the level of justification and bracketing the issue of what is decided by those who enter the debate, whether or not that is to say the results can be construed as rational. We're also relying on a counterfactual faith that the general in particular, the general and concrete other, can ultimately be reconciled, that the negative dialectic embraced by, say, Adorno as an antidote to forced sublations that fold non-identity into a harmonious unity can in fact become somehow positive. Force is explicit in his embrace of a reason that is, quote, the uncoerced integration of the individual in the whole, end quote. But it seems to me not very clear how we are to treat those outliers, the people who just refuse to let themselves be persuaded. How do we tell them that their reasons are not really generalizable? Or how do we really know who makes the decision when to declare, quote, that reasons can reciprocally and generally be shared when those reasons that can be really are embraced by all? I mean, the can is a kind of thought experiment. Who is to decide whether or not that really gives the stamp of approval? Force acknowledges that the process is open-ended and infinitely revisable. But it's difficult, it seems to me, to apply the criteria of reciprocity and generalizability when they're perpetually and always counterfactual. As Hent de Vries, who comes from a basically deconstructionist perspective, has skeptically put it, with regard to the criterion of generalizability, quote, who exactly is included and excluded in this set? Who judges whom is fit for inclusion, and on what grounds? The answer is as simple as it is mind-boggling. All relevant others. The omni-inclusive community of autonomous humans capable of speech and communication. Well, he says, what about Kant's broader community of all intelligible beings, or the non-human animals included by Adorno and Derrida? Who decides whether they are relevant in this debate? And obviously, to look to the more modest notion of which human adults are available, how can we talk about the relevant community of all humankind? All right, so I'm not sure that this is sufficient. It remains still with the level of warranted assertability, working on reasons that somehow involve generalizability and reciprocity. Might there be a better criterion, however, in that phrase, and I come back to it now, that Velmer gave us, progress in knowledge? Might progress in knowledge be in some ways useful for our reconstruction of the ideal of a reasonable reason? Invoking it as the outcome of rational deliberation, progress in knowledge is the outcome, inevitably raises, of course, the thorny question of the relationship between what is accepted after all the arguments are made, and the participants are all persuaded of the validity, let's assume that happens, and then the truth of what is the case in terms of cognition, at least, on the other. And here we're bracketing moral issues. It will take us too long to go down that path. There is built into the process of discursive reasoning the understanding that today's justified consensus, everybody in this room agrees what is reasonable, that this is possibly going to be improved on, perhaps even surpassed by future ones ad infinitum. Now, it's interesting that Habermas's own position on this question, this precise question, underwent a crucial evolution. Originally, because of his suspicion of positivism and embrace of universal pragmatics, he focuses attention almost entirely on the illocutionary rather than locutionary or perlocutionary aspect of speech acts. That is, only on the process of discursive justification of an assertion rather than its extra discursive truth. So yes, you can have a rational justification, but someone, say, in the 11th century would rationally have justified the fact that the sun goes around the earth, and everybody in the room would have agreed. But we now know that that was not true. Rationality involved only the former, only the justification, when it employed those procedures of disinterested validity testing that approach the conditions of the ideal speech situation. Thus, in 1982, Habermas could write, I do not think it makes sense to speak at all of the rationality of knowledge. We should rather reserve the predicate rational for the use of knowledge in linguistic utterances and in actions. Communication and purpose of activity stand in internal relation to grounds or reasons, because subjects capable of speech and action employ knowledge in speaking and acting and connect with their utterances, at least implicitly, claims to validity or to success. Now, statements like this, which basically is an internalist notion of justification as self-sufficient, allowed commentators such as Herbert Schnadelbach to conclude, quote, that one could give up cognitivism without having to contest that rational utterances of action as a rule purport to follow good reasons and stand the test of an objective assessment. The standard for this cannot be sought, he says, in the truth of the knowledge involved, but in the rules of consensus formation through argumentation. This is indeed the approach taken by Habermas. Similarly, Joseph Heath, one of his commentators fairly recently, could assert that the theories of truth and justification that Habermas develops are both, in a broad sense, anti-realist. So this is what we might call early Habermas, the Habermas who's not interested in the realistic truth value of the rational consensus. We can agree, warranted assertions, we can make statements that we all agree are right, but we don't have to then test them against something outside of the process. But in time, Habermas came to distinguish much more sharply between a rationally achieved consensus and what might be called the extra discursive truth beyond that consensus. And in so doing, restored, we might say, more of a balance between the locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary, or we might even call it communicative and representational functions of speech acts. Indeed, as he was to concede in his reply to the critics of his great mega work, The Theory of Communicative Action, quote, "I do not understand the discourse theory of truth to mean that the consensus achieved discursively is a criterion of truth, as was the case in some of my earlier statements." It was those earlier statements that led to that rehearsal of position by Schnedelbach and Heath that I mentioned before. He says now, and I quote him, "True beliefs, after all, can be held irrationally." That point I made about going around the sun, going around the earth, and without justification. And conversely, the rationality of a judgment does not imply its truth, but merely its justified acceptability in a given context. So, in a way, he's moving back towards, let's call it a kind of modified realism here. Against radical conventionalists like Richard Rorty, who blithely identified truth entirely with the discursive justification of the finite community, he argued that a world external to our construction of it made learning possible. How? By stubbornly resisting false explanations. Truth, in other words, is not merely a function of discursive consensus, or, quote, rational acceptability, unquote, but also has a pragmatic value, one that extends beyond whether or not it is achieved by rational argumentation. So here we see Habermas moving beyond the overemphasis on the linguistification of reason, the overemphasis on what in Rorty would be perhaps, in a way, vulnerable as a linguistic idealism. Here, interestingly, it was the perlocutionary effect of speech acts, what they affected in the world in terms of solving problems, that emerged as a consideration beyond the illocutionary intention of those involved in the discourse. Habermas had early considered the former only from the perspective of strategic action, solving problems just strategic action, with its telos of success, which was, he argued, inferior to the goal of agreement. But he came to appreciate that there was an inextricable link between language and action, action which involved testing our rationally achieved justifications, testing them against a world that was always more than our discursive constructions. He writes, "In everyday practice, we cannot use language without acting. Speech itself is affected in the mode of speech acts that for their part are embedded in contexts of interaction and entwined with instrumental actions. As actors, that is, as interacting and intervening subjects, we're always already in contact with things about which we can make statements," end quote. Now, we can never have certain knowledge of those things, that's true, or we can't have access to causes without the mediation of the reasons we offer discursively for believing in them. But without their resistance, we could not get beyond whatever consensus happened to be reached, even by the most rational argumentation, if the result was mistaken. That is, we could not say that knowledge was fallible if the world were nothing but an effect of our discursive constructions. Or to put it in other terms, if reference were nothing but a function of meaning. Reference were nothing but a function of meaning. Rather than solely focusing on intersubjective I-thou relations, as he had done in his battle with subject-centered mentalist philosophies of consciousness, it was thus tacitly necessary, and maybe even more explicitly, to restore at least a rough balance with I-it relationships. Without falling back on the empiricist or positivist epistemology he had joined with Adorno in criticizing during the dispute with Popper and his followers, this may sound to some of you somewhat Popperian in terms of falsification. It's different because he doesn't believe that there are ways to get access to real facts which then falsify statements. Habermas now acknowledged that a pragmatism that fails to take into account the recalcitrant givens of the world, the recalcitrant things, objects, external realities out there, could not hope to solve the problems that they posed. Whatever the implications these considerations might have for a theory of truth, they appear no less significant for a theory of reason, although precisely what they were remains contested. One approach has stressed the continued importance of keeping reason apart from strong truth claims. A major difference between cognitive statements, especially those made by science, and rational judgments, so Raymond Goiz has argued, is in fact that truth and falsity, as used in science, do not admit of degrees. A proposition is true or false, and he says tertium non datur, there's no higher third or something in between. But rationality, at least Goiz argues, is not like that. Decisions, preferences, attitudes, etc., can be more or less rational. Agents can have stronger or weaker warrant for their actions, can be more or less aware of their own motives, can be more or less enlightened in their normative beliefs. Charles Taylor has argued for something similar with the idea of reasoning in transitions, is his phrase, which involves comparative rather than absolute judgments, which one is superior to the other but not itself perfectly true. But a very different reading can be found in other commentators, such as Christina Lafond, who respond to the statements in Habermas's work that suggest there is a vital cognitive moment as well in a more robust notion of rationality. She notes, for example, that the chapter Habermas writes called Rationality, a preliminary determination of the concept in inferior communicative action, begins by stressing the closeness between knowledge and reason, even if he then does bracket the former in order to focus only on the latter. By the 1990s, Habermas was carefully arguing against both the collapse of truth into rational discursive justification, that is, a purely consensus theory of truth, and their absolute separation. So once again, a kind of intermediate position. He writes, although we cannot sever the connection of truth and justification, this epistemologically unavoidable connection must not be turned into a conceptually inseparable connection in the form of an epistemic concept of truth. And what he means by epistemic concept of truth is one based solely on a kind of consensus theory in which the truth is just what we warrant in our warranted assertions come to believe it is. Bringing back the cognitivist moment entangled the rational deliberation helps to avoid the conclusion that language alone is the locus of rationality after its eclipse. It gets us beyond linguistic idealism, which bedevils certain pragmatists like Rorty, and restores the link with the world that is more than what we make of it, more than our justifications for a truth that is not equivalent to a mere epistemic consensus alone. In losing the regulative idea of truth, Habermas warned, the practice of justification loses that point of orientation by means of which standards of justification are distinguished from customary norms. The sociologizing of the practice of justification means a naturalization of reason. So you can see Habermas is resisting keeping up some sort of hope for getting beyond just customary norms or the community today. Even under the ideal conditions of argumentation, at its most open, symmetrical, and inclusive, even then reasons may, well, prove fallible, and conclusions open to revision. For Habermas, it was Charles Sanders Peirce's understanding of the irreducibility of the things of the world to their semiotic representations and efforts to categorize them, developed in our own day in Hilary Putnam's nominalist defense of what he calls internal realism, that shows the value of a pragmatism that refuses to collapse everything into our epistemic understandings or linguistic categorizations. It knows the difference between propositions and facts on the one hand and the things that are prior to them on the other, things that can be referred to under different descriptions. As Lafond stresses, it links reason once again to an unending learning process based on problem solving about something that is not reducible to cultural immanence, linguistic relativism. Or to put it another way, conclusions reached by discursive validity testing have to be tested further in action and can always be revised in the future. As Habermas was to put it in his late essay on communicative action and the detranscendentalized use of reason, quote, even after the knowing subject is detranscendentalized, a gap remains between what is true and what is warranted or rationally acceptable to us. Although this gap cannot be definitively closed within discourse, it can be closed pragmatically through a rationally motivated transition from discourse to action, end quote. Now it's interesting that in the idiom of the older Frankfurt School, the first generation, Habermas's growing appreciation of the limits of discursive rationality may recall Adorno's stress on the predominance of the object in negative dialectics. As Velmer has noted, despite the problematic messianic residues in Adorno's notion of reason as redemptive reconciliation, quote, perhaps it's possible to justify Adorno's insistence on a subject-object model of cognition. Concealed within Adorno's use of this model, there are perhaps elements of a concept of rationality that is not aimed at reconciliation, but at the possibility of conceiving reason without the hope of ultimate reconciliation, end quote. Whereas Adorno may have sought the limits of monologic conceptual domination in works of art, whose mimetically resonant particulars resist subsumption under rational categories, the later Habermas sought a parallel limit to the intersubjective discursive domination of the things of the world. In both instances, it was not a matter of reason and its others as a simple opposition, but rather an understanding of both the necessity and the limitations of rationality, however it might be defined. Reason, in other words, is both the source of critique and its object, both, as it were, the wound and the cure. Well, all right, what then might we ask in conclusion was the function of a restored but chastened reason, limited reason, after its eclipse? When the term rationalization is extended into the social realm, as Habermas, following Weber, thought it must be, it alerts us to the functional purpose of reason. Reason is not just a game, it functions. Forms of life, such as the public sphere or democratic political institutions, can be called rational, he writes, quote, to the degree that they are conducive to the solutions of problems that arise. To this extent, although forms of life qualify as candidates for the term rational, they do so only in the indirect sense that they constitute the more or less congenial background for establishing discursive procedures and for developing reflexive capacities. In this way, they can provide capacities for problem solving that, for their part, enable rational beliefs, actions, and communications, end quote. Solving problems. Well, solving problems was, of course, the terminology of the pragmatism that the early Frankfurt School had, in fact, scorned. But Habermas had learned from what is sometimes been called the Kantian pragmatism of contemporary figures like Hilary Putnam and Robert Brandon, and he has a number of essays where he's in dialogue with them and accepts some of their positions. In theory of communicative action, Habermas had distinguished between instrumental and functionalist rationality, moving away from the earlier Frankfurt School collapse of the two. Drawing on Luhmann, he'd acknowledged the role functional reason might in fact play in those subsystems of administration and the economy that were outside of social interaction and intersubjective communication, maintaining them without drawing on the intentionality of agents as an instrumental reason. In the terminology introduced by Schnedelbach, it allowed him to posit both a dispositional or intentional and non-dispositional view of reason, the former attributing it only to persons, the latter to systems. Although this did open him to the criticism that he had conceded perhaps too much to systems theory in his conceptualization of modernity, it did raise the question of the function played by communicative reason as well. Now let me just finish by a few remarks about the function of reason. If we accept that functionalization is not the same thing as instrumental rationality. It's been very recently argued by the behavioral scientists Hugo Mercier and Dan Speber, tacitly recalling the claims of Nietzsche and Foucault, that in the evolutionary process, argumentative reason did not in fact have the at least original function of arriving at better beliefs and sounder decisions, let alone giving us access to the truth. Instead, they claim it was merely a tool in persuading one's opponents, an instrument in an adversarial game of power. Flawed reasoning, rather than being a defect, could itself, they claim, be functional in that outcome, as could confirmation bias, evident in using reason to support prior opinions and beliefs. But even supporters of this view, which draws on the strong naturalism that Habermas has criticized in a much weaker version, even they concede that reason can transcend this initial function, especially when group reasoning supplants monological or logocentric inferential ratiocination. Avoiding the genetic fallacy means, after all, refusing to trace the meaning of an idea or practice to its roots and denying it an opportunity to grow beyond them. Now, Habermas, as we've noted, has not been a starry-eyed utopian when it comes to the realization of a fully rational form of life. Nor has he lost sight of the ways in which strategic thinking and instrumental reason can vie for prominence with communicative rationality. He's admitted that reason has no concrete social addressee to replace the proletariat in the Marxist imaginary. Indeed, he says it has no body, cannot suffer, and also arouses no passion. If one asks what the function of communicative rationality itself might be, The only answer, it seems to me, can come from exploring the ways in which it has functioned in the practices that have developed as our species grapples with the inadequacies of our instinctual life. Among those, as the Frankfurt School always knew, and as Habermas still, I think, insists on telling us, however much its members may have disagreed over the nature of reason itself, among those was critique of the inadequate solutions of the past and consideration of possible superior alternatives for the future. Communicative rationality, Habermas has noted, operates in history as an avenging force, refusing to affirm what cries out to be criticized, inspiring us to transcend the fatalism of our condition. In this sense, its most basic function is not system maintenance or even solutions to local problems, but rather the imagination of radical alternatives to the flawed status quo and the damaged lives it produces. Or to put it in terms that suggest Habermas never identified entirely with the pragmatist tradition, communicative reason has to diagnose the level where root causes of a problem might be, and have the courage to contemplate solutions that transcend the immediate normative context that blocks fundamental responses. So the stakes in maintaining some version of reason are very high. And I want to finish with a remark of Axel Honneth, which I think captures this very nicely. Honneth writes in The Social Pathology of Reason on the intellectual legacy of critical theory, and I quote him, "Only as long as the theory can count on such a rational impulse for its grounding will it be able to relate itself reflexively to a potential practice in which the explanation it offers is implemented with a view to liberation from suffering. Critical theory will only be able to continue in the form in which it developed from Horkheimer to Habermas if it does not forsake the proof of such interests. Without a realistic concept of emancipatory interest that puts at its center the idea of an indestructible core of rational responsiveness on the part of subjects, this critical project will have no future." Thanks very much for your attention.
I have a small technical question and a larger question. The small technical question is, could you explain, maybe I didn't catch the difference between reasons and justification? Could say a little more on that. The larger question is whether you could say maybe more about who this discourse as a whole, I mean, what is it an alternative to? You did it beautifully with a section on Heidegger. So in that moment of time, I kind of understand, but what's the alternative that this group as a whole is actually arguing against? What alternative is it?
Reasons and justifications. I think they're very, very closely related. Forced in particular has emphasized the right to justifications that we have as our basic right, that we have the right to have other people's actions justified to us before we accept them. I would guess that perhaps the difference is there can be justifications that are not rational. I mean, I could, say to my son, you must clean up your room, and he says, "Why?" And I said, "Because I'm your father, and you have to clean up the room." So, in other words, there are various kinds of justifications, or I could say, well, divine inspiration is a justification. Justification perhaps a broader category than a rational justification. Now, as for the alternatives, I mean, there are many. One of them is what I've identified as a kind of linguistic idealism, somehow used Richard Rorty as a figure who represents this. The position there is that all we have are communities, epistemic communities, using justifications, arguments to come to some sort of agreement. But we don't have any standard by which we could measure that against other communities' agreements. Everything is basically local, everything is almost ethnocentric. We have no ability to argue against other people. All we can do is accept or not accept, but it's a kind of almost decisionism. So there's a loss of faith in the possibility of trans-communal justification, trumping, as it were, the isolated incommensurability of a particular local group. That's one aspect. The second aspect is the issue, and this is, I think, the importance of the learning process notion, that the justifications of a community may be accepted using the most, let's say, open, warranted assertability standards of validity testing, in which, I listen to you, you give me logical reasons, you give me what evidence you have, we come to an agreement based on that, everybody else in the room agrees, we come out of the room saying, yes, this is in fact the case. But then there is something outside the world of our internal discussion, something outside it which may in fact give us a different answer. And we learn from that. We are, in a way, disconfirmed in our illusory version of truth claims, cognitive claims, by the recalcitrance of the world. So it's in that learning process that we understand that our reasoning is fallibilist. So this is, I mean, one sees how this whole sort of discourse is moving smaller and, it's getting more and more modest in its claims. So it's not reason as somehow giving us the truth, but reason as giving us processes which know that they can't come up with the truth, that they can't come up with absolute answers, that they have always an openness to future disconfirmation through new evidence, new logic, new recalcitrance. And that's, I think, something that's also crucial. So it doesn't have the, let's say, hubristic belief that science or other types of testing of our relationship to the world will produce a final truth, a correct version of the world. So I think those are among the distinctions. There are probably others, but those are the ones that come to mind. I mean, also, obviously, we mentioned Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger's emphasis on world disclosure, that there's somehow a way in which problem solving is not really what language at its most magical does. What language most magical does through poetry, through a restoration of the correct etymology that the Greeks used and whatever. Language reveals something to us. We wait for it, we're in the opening, language shows itself. Language is capable of getting us in touch with something that we don't construct, that isn't subjectively imposed, and that we are waiting for that and caring for it when it appears. From Habermas's point of view, this is very, very passive, authoritarian, has all types of politically nefarious implications and so forth. So instead, it's this emphasis on giving reasons and being humble and listening to the other and not assuming the world will reveal itself. Now, having said that, there is a moment of world disclosure in Habermas's own larger, we might say, system. Because we are talking about not only the natural world, but also about the social cultural world, the world of meaning for us. And I didn't talk about morality much, I didn't talk about the aesthetic, but one would have to think about what these processes would mean in those worlds. And there, the importance of the disclosure meaning through traditions, through art, through experiments in imagination, all of that provides some sort of grist, we might say, for the mill of validity testing. So, let's say an artist comes out with some sort of new way of interpreting sound through music that we've never heard before. Well, we can, talk about it as noise, we can talk about it as uninteresting, we talk about it as, in some ways deeply problematic, or we can say this changes our understanding of what was natural in, say, tonal music, or what is natural in terms of Western experience, whatever the kind of version traditional music might be. We might say it's part of the learning process. So that comes not through problem solving itself. I mean, maybe some musician is trying to solve problems given by his predecessor or her predecessor, but by and large comes through an act of artistic imagination. And then that becomes available for humans to think about what that means and what is open to us through that meaning. So world disclosure is a dimension of linguisticality, broadly speaking, but it's not the only one. And Habermas obviously chooses to emphasize problem solving over world disclosure. There's very little problem solving in Heidegger. I mean, that's not what he thinks language at its best does. And that's too technological. It's too based on an instrumental view of reason and of language.
You said that sort of the limitations of reason make things, sort of the claims are more modest and more localized. Right. But it seems to go also in the other direction. It becomes, the persuasiveness of reason becomes an aggregate. And so it's an aggregate story that we can, the more people we convince, right, the better the argument becomes. So the communicativeness of it becomes almost a statistical thing. And in a sense, you said before, the outlier can screw it all up, but in fact, right, the outlier cannot. Because if we have a large enough group, that's like, in a statistical sense, we've actually proven our point, even if it's not absolutely proven. Yes, and in a way, it's a kind of it's a model that balloons out. So if you say intercommunal, persuasion is difficult. Well, if you have enough communities, you do the same. Like, so the aggregateness averages out the particularities of individuals, or can also average out the particularities of communities.
Well, it's a good point. I mean, I think this works certainly for cognitive knowledge, so that, you know, if I've discovered how to split the atom and create an atomic weapon, that's knowledge that can be shared, alas, by lots of other people around the world. And therefore, there is a sense in which we've enlarged the capacity of people to use a certain kind of reason to make sense of the, processes of atomic energy. Does it work for the meanings that we live by within our community? Does it work for aesthetic rationality? Well, maybe. I mean, if there is a kind of translation possibility, human rights is a discourse which supposedly transcends and trumps specific local versions of communal rights and so forth. So occasionally we do try to move beyond. So there is an ambition in this, which is the ambition to be as inclusive as possible. To say, you know, there is no society, there is no culture in which people don't reason. There's no culture and no language in which reasons are not offered. Now, whether or not those are rational reasons, good reasons, in the sense that I've argued they try to grapple with here, that may not be the case. But still, in language itself, so Harbormans would argue, there is the potential for the reasoning process, the giving and asking for reasons, to be actuated, to be even institutionalized. So that in a, I mean, this is you know, something that in the scholarly world we're more familiar with in other contexts. We will ask, as we are doing here, for reasons. Why do you think this? And I have to, you know, respond, and I have to give you a reason. You're either persuaded or not. I may be persuaded by you. We argue that there are processes like, you know, blind submission, which get away from the idea of who is making the argument. The argument stands on its own feet, and referee journals and all that. Now, it may be idealized, not always fully realized, but there's that sense of inclusion. So anybody could send an article. A kid from the you know, third grade can send an article to a scholarly journal, and if it's brilliant, it gets published. You know, it occasionally happens that an outlier does. So there is the possibility, the potential for inclusion. Now, of course, there are many reasons why people, for practical and other reasons, are not included. So it's an ideal, typical type of thing. But the modesty comes with the fact that it's never going to be, you know, fully achieved as a form of life, and that also there may be local varieties and reasons that are considered good reasons, and there may be local varieties in the ways in which these processes, you know, are carried out, and then there may be translations which are sometimes good and not so good between or among those various groups. So, you know, it does have species-wide, let's say, the hope is the teleology of species-wide consensus. But it's obviously counterfactual. But the alternatives being eternal dissent, or the idea that dissensus or antagonism is somehow a virtue, that struggle is always struggle to the death between people who are in a kind of, you know, like the, master-slave relationship, where they're, you know, one slave is always going to need to overcome the master to become master, and there can't be any absolute symmetry. Reciprocity is not something that I think this theory feels comfortable. Please.
Yeah, first of all, your comment about your son. I'm your father. I remember this lovely comment by Ring Lardner when he said, "Shut up, my father explained." Right. More seriously, your last comment, which was taken from Axel Hahn, suffering. It wasn't mentioned throughout, but it's the cornerstone. So it seems to me that by eliding the moral element, we're not getting very far. I don't know what is meant there by suffering. I also know that the main problem, I mean, as we talk here about instrumental and substantive reason, on our border, there are two warring parties. And the question is, in any way, does the Habermasian model allow, first of all, for any kind of communication between these sides, because they both think they are rational, and I see very little in the model that would allow it. In other words, the inclusiveness to get rid of suffering is an inclusive project. But basically, the inclusion is community-wide. You can increase the community, but it's limited to a single community. So I'm worrying, first of all, about that. And secondly, the model assumes something which is pre-rational. Let's assume it's correct. And that is the empathic capacity, about which I hear nothing. Without the empathic capacity, you can't even begin to understand the suffering of others. So it seems to me too rational a perspective.
Several points, excellent points. First of all, suffering, Adorno, I mentioned briefly, the understanding of art as a place in which suffering is registered. Habermas doesn't focus on the issue of suffering, but it's certainly, I think, implicit in the argument that if we reason, we may well avoid violence and may well avoid the suffering produced by violence. And we also may reason about the ways we solve problems in the social world, at least, and maybe, let's say, through medicine or the natural world as well, to lessen suffering, to increase happiness. So it's one of the possibilities, certainly, to which we could put reasoning. And there's care and there's empathy and there are lots of emotions that generate our desire to use reason for those purposes. So all the care in the world I might have, unless I use reason to cure the illness of the child, doesn't save the child. So it has to be both. Now it's Axel Honneth's work on recognition, which involves a much more, I would say, thoroughgoing understanding of the empathetic and the ways in which you have to have a certain recognition. There are various levels. You can have love between strangers. You can have empathy that extends to abstractions. It becomes complicated. The general and the concrete other becomes, engaged here in a kind of interesting, maybe negative dialectic, where the abstract general other is someone I don't love. He's a stranger. He's impersonal. He's someone I have a legal relation, contractual relation. The immediate other, the other who is in my family, my friendship circle, is the other that I can relate to more empathetically. And then an absolute empathy for every human being is very difficult. Now, as for a situation in which communicative rationality breaks down and you end up with strategic interaction, including violence, and obviously war is the reductio ad absurdum of that breakdown. Luckily in human endeavors, that's the exception rather than the rule. And the vast majority of our interactions within a community and between communities does not resort to war or violence. And we know that wars also end, sometimes through victory, sometimes through compromise, sometimes through exhaustion, and lots of reasons how these things can be resolved. In that process, although sometimes power and a variety of other factors play a very key role, sometimes intersubjective interaction, rationality of this level can in fact be useful. It also can be useful in avoiding war. I mean, there are many, many contexts. I mean, take the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which war go to the brink, but there's some way in which they communicate, some way in which they realize how terrible this outcome would be, and they decide, not to have a consensus, but they decide that, well, okay, we can avoid it through basically figuring out how to get beyond the impasse. Also, within a community, I mean, when a society, I mean, not to get too specific, but I mean, Israel today has many different options, and there are ways in which the society has to decide which options to exercise. And how is that going to be done? Do you just cede control to the leadership? Do you cede control to a military or someone who has a button that he or she could push without deliberation? I mean, there are people like Elaine Scarry who said that the atomic age, it goes against the American Constitution because we have a president who can push a button without deliberation and incinerate the entire world, and this is not democracy. So it's anti-constitutional against unconstitutional to have that capacity, and it's a little utopian on her part, but that's her argument. So there is within a community, when it comes to the declaration of war, usually some sort of deliberative process. I mean, maybe there's a Pearl Harbor where basically fate is already accompli, as it were, but in most cases there are some choices. So in the process, I mean, the point is it's not either or. That sure there's strategic use, sure there is manipulation, sure there is demagoguery, sure there is, the use of power. It's a question of whether or not this kind of reasoning creates alternatives and has institutional basis for the delaying, let's say, of the resort to the violence, the delaying of the resort to strategic action and power. And it's Habermas's non-utopian, but nonetheless still Enlightenment optimistic hope that it's getting a little bit better. And maybe, you know, the future it'll get better still, but there's no guarantee. So I think that's, you know, the level in which to take it. Not it's all silly nonsense or it's all, you know, about to happen, but rather understand its role in the mix and to see it as something worth nurturing rather than just dismissing out of hand. The moral question is very different, and you know, I have a few places and footnotes elsewhere I address that. He, of course, has a very extensive discursive notion of ethics. There's a big debate about that, and I think, frankly, it's been less successful, precisely. And this is where I think the issue is joined. That thing outside of the community of agreement, that cognitive truth-telling otherness that, say, Peirce talked about when he talked about secondness, something that's out there, the rock that when I kick it, it hurts me, even though I may assume it's just a fiction of my imagination. It's hard to know what that looks like in moral terms. I mean, the moral community is more, as it were, discursively validated, rather than something that abuts against nature or God or some external notion of absolute morality. It's hard to know exactly what that looks like. I mean, he does have a distinction which he draws from German idealism between morality, which is more universal, and ethics, which is more communal, and sees ethics as judgeable in the name of morality. But those of us who are not so happy with the idea of universal morality, in a way, it's a difficult, I think, argument to make. So I didn't really address that, but it's an important point to look at.
If you have any more questions, speak them now or forever hold your peace. So, yes. Let me thank Marty J. one more time for the whole series and for coming to Jerusalem and you know, really kind of enriching us in ways that we still need to read the book for, which will come, you know, you all know this, right? This is all going to be published as a book, and so you all get to review it all and then ask more questions later. Thank you very much.